Hello, today is Wednesday, November 13th, 2019. This is the Cluster API office hours. This is a recorded meeting and we are a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We do have a meeting notes document, which I encourage you to open up, and we have meeting etiquette. Please use the raise hand feature of Zoom, and I will do my best to call on you, assuming I can see your hand is up. And we also have in the agenda document a place to add discussion topics, so please do so if you've got anything. And also, please make sure that you add your name to the attending list as well. I apologize for the noise in the background. There's leaf blowing going on. And I will turn it over to Jason for the first PSA.
Yes. So if you are planning on attending KubeCon and you don't have anything to do Thursday morning, we are coordinating a Cluster API meet and greet breakfast. The link is in the agenda doc, and feel free to show up, eat some food, and chat with other Cluster API users and contributors. We are not doing any type of planning or any real work here. It is just a forum for us to be able to see each other face to face, since we're mostly interacting online.
All right, thanks, Jason. You also have the first discussion topic.
Yep. We have some folks within VMware that are working on kind of expanding out the EDE tests that we have in the AWS provider. And I wanted to see, mainly get buy-in from others to kind of hold off adopting the EDE framework work stuff that Chuck is doing for the AWS provider until later in the cycle, so that we don't interrupt those folks that are working on the EDE tests expansion right now, and then prior to cutting the V1 Alpha 3 release, we can refactor things to consume the EDE framework then.
Chuck, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, that sounds totally good. I just wanted to say that's thank you for letting me know that you wanted to hold off on that work. But yeah, there's a lot of great work going on in the AWS EDE tests that we can definitely use in the framework. So I'm looking forward to integrating that.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Warren. Looks like you're still muted, Warren.
Yep, sorry. Does that mean that we should hold off on adding E2E or using the E2E test framework for other providers, like for example, the GCP provider?
I don't think so. I just wanted to raise it for the AWS provider because we have active work going on right there, right now. And because we're getting ready to start introducing the breaking changes for V1 Alpha 3 as soon as we kick off the control plane work and things like that. And I didn't want to try to block the EDE work that we have on the AWS side. But it shouldn't impact other providers unless they also have active EDE work. And GCP in particular, I'm not aware of anything.
Chuck, back to you.
Yeah, so one thing to note is it's still changing. So if you would like to work on the EDE framework in GCP, that would be awesome. And I would love to know your feedback from an actual implementer standpoint. And that can help shape sort of the direction that the framework is going. So if you were looking to do that work, I would love to hear your experience in using it.
Somewhat related to that, since it does involve a Go module dependency for, say, CAPG pulling in Cluster API, I'm wondering if we want to consider more frequent alpha tags of the Cluster API repository, not to indicate that it's close to release, but just so downstream providers could have a Go module dependency on a tag instead of just some random commit from master. Anybody have any thoughts on that? That's
Yes, I do. I like that idea, and I think it was also like something that came out at the face-to-face. We should, though, kind of like remove the pre-release tag on the current releases, at least for bit 02, and use those for these kind of releases, so that there is like clear, like a tag like in GitHub that like says like this is, hey, this is a pre-release, don't use it.
so you're saying you want all of the current GitHub releases to not be pre-releases anymore, and then the alphas would be pre-releases?
Yes, it's possible.
How do you all feel about making what's currently out there not a GitHub pre-release? Anybody have any strong objections to it?
Just to clarify, like if you go to the link that just showed, like it's just the pre-release tag on the upper left side. I'm not sure if you can navigate to that, Andy, so that we can all be on the same page. But
Chuck, I saw your hand was briefly up. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just curious if there were any implications for removing the pre-release tag besides the little label.
So one thing that GitHub does have is a concept of a latest release, and that is not available or accessible if you only have pre-releases. So if you try to go into the either the API or the browser and say, hey, GitHub, what's the latest cluster API release? You won't get anything because everything's pre-released right now. All right, so why don't we maybe file a GitHub issue to continue discussion on this one, so we at least have the tracker on it, or what do y'all think? And also, Andrew, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was going to agree with that and just comment that this is sort of something that Matt had brought up in regards to Go modules, and I think Chuck and I've discussed it before. It just drives you to a 1.0 faster. That may not actually be technically a 1.0, but all of the tooling seems to exist around post 1.0. Yeah, I mean, it almost feels like if we're going to no longer be pre-released, then at some point, do we just go to that 1.0? Chuck, I think you had suggested that.
no, we really shouldn't, and we don't want to go into this again, but we're following the Kubernetes versions and not the Go module yet. So once we're like ready to go to V1 API types, we'll probably also like release a V1 version of Cluster API.
Yeah, there is a distinction, or it's not necessarily correlated, that a GitHub release being a pre-release or not a pre-release versus the semantic version of the code base. It kind of seems like they should go together, but there's not a strict requirement that it does. And we also did have a lot of discussion around, should we take Cluster API to 1.0.0 and say, like, we're now stable-ish, and if we want to make breaking changes, we'll go to V2. And we essentially decided that until we're ready to change the API to maybe beta, definitely GA, that we're going to stay below 1.0. Jason?
So I think one of the challenges that we're going to have, and this is going to be related to a few of the different changes that we made, is that I think our GitHub releases tab is going to become pretty much useless. And we're going to have to figure out a different way to promote releases, whether it's in the Gitbook or whatever we do. But we're going to have like multiple different artifacts being published under GitHub releases, and we're going to have the pre-releases and the stable releases going there, and it's going to be difficult for folks to just go to the releases tab and download stuff like they're doing today.
All right, should we, I'm happy to continue the discussion, or we can go to a GitHub issue. Either is fine with me. There's more to talk about.
Can whoever is eating mute themselves, please?
All right, I think I got everybody muted. Lubomir, you wrote, that's the side effect of having the providers as part of the same repo. Yeah, so if we have multiple things that we're releasing from the same GitHub repository, then yes, you would be seeing multiple tags, like one for Cluster API, one for the Bootstrap provider, were we to do that as a separate release. But at this point, as far as I know and remember, we're just treating CapD, the Docker provider, as potentially having a separate version than Cluster API itself. Is that right, Chuck, or am I forgetting what we decided?
Yeah, that's right. But I think because each module would need to be semantic versioned. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work for something like the framework, or which I think is the only other module that we have in the Cluster API repo. Because it's all like pre 1.0 anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, why don't we take an action item to file a GitHub issue and continue the discussion there for anybody who's not here today. And then we can revisit this again at our next meeting, which I'm guessing will probably be in 2 or 3 weeks, depending on Thanksgiving, and if we have this, since I imagine we will not be having this meeting next week for KubeCon. All right, Jason or Nadir, would you be willing to discuss the status of the control plane cap?
Yeah, so we've started getting multiple approvals on it. I haven't seen very much feedback. There was one comment from Moshe asking about changing an annotation to a label. And I think that's something that we can likely address pretty quick in follow-up. I don't see him on the call, but I'll reach out to him to see if he's okay with us addressing that post-merge. But other than that, just waiting on final approvals or timeout for lazy consensus.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I think that we are at a point where with lazy consensus, we can merge today. We can file a follow-up issue for Moshe's comment if we don't get a response today, and we can start working on creating the individual GitHub issues for all of the work items. I did see that Chuck had created an umbrella tracker, which is great. Thank you, Chuck. But I'm very excited to see that we're at the end of the road here for the proposal. I don't have this, I meant to add this into the agenda in terms of the other caps. So we have, we've merged the ClusterCuddle v2 cap, the testing cap, but we still have the machine remediation open and machine pool open, and we have a new one from Moshe for load balancing. So I'm just looking at the attendees here. Do we have representatives for either machine pool or remediation here today to talk about the status? Don't think so.
Hey, Andy.
Oh, hey, Alberto.
Yeah, this is Alberto speaking. Yeah, I can talk about the machine health checking one. So yeah, thanks everyone who shared feedback so far. I've been trying to address all the comments. So yeah, just happy to to see more feedback coming, and keep the discussion going. And otherwise, just let me know how can I help to move forward with this.
Okay, thanks. So 1 second, Vince. If you haven't seen it, the remediation proposal is up here along with the machine pool as well. So those are links to the 2 pull requests for those proposals. Vince, go ahead.
Yeah, I chatted yesterday with Julie for the machine pool proposal. So there's like a few action items, which is one to kind of like just put better the goals like in place, and kind of like the changes to the Bootstrap provider a little bit in more detail. And I think after that, like we can probably like go ahead and seek approval to merge the proposal relatively soon, and then we kind of like agree to like follow up with like issues or PRs to the proposal, and yeah, move it to the finish line.
Okay, thanks, Vince. All right, so the last item that I have in here was about the KEP process and potentially doing a retrospective either today or sometime in the future. I did want to get us together as a group to just talk about or reflect on the V1 Alpha 2 proposal process, the V1 Alpha 3 process, and if there are things that we can do better going forward. So it's probably better to announce this in advance and then make sure people are available to discuss it in the future. Does that seem like the best course of action, or should we try and have that conversation now? Anyone? Okay, Jason's a +1 on announcing. All right, so I will take an action item to communicate to the group that we would like to do a retrospective on the KEP process and plan for a time to do this at one of our future office hours. All right, does anybody have any other agenda items, or should we move on to backlog grooming? Okay, I don't see anything. So we have 9 issues in Cluster API that do not have a milestone. So I'm going to start at the bottom here and work my way up. So the first one is to add GCP provider instructions to the docs. It looks like our Smitty wants to work on it. So I think that we can probably move this into the milestone. What do y'all think? Sound good to you, Vince, Jason?
Yeah.
Great. And we will give this a priority of soon. Alrighty, next up is an issue with CAPD. I know that Chuck had some conversation with the reporter in Slack about this one. Doesn't have any traction here. Chuck, did you get a chance to look at this at all?
No, I haven't looked at this. No, I haven't looked at this yet. I don't know if this is still an active issue or not.
Okay. Would you like me to assign it to you, or is anybody else interested in trying to tackle this? At least track it down and triage it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be just to reproduce, see if it's reproducible. But you can assign it to me. That's fine, unless somebody else would like to do it.
All right. Oops. Not what that is. Come on. There we go. Thanks, Chuck. And I'm going to put this in next for right now.
Yeah, next is fine. Long-term important is probably okay.
Okay. You can consistently attributes. Okay, next up is a request to add fields to the kubeadm config spec for kubeproxy config and kubelet config. This is a copy and paste typo here, but it is two different types. I did see that kubeadm does allow you to specify the kubelet config and the kubeproxy config, so this seems reasonable to me, but I'm not a kubeadm expert, so I will defer to others. And Andrew, I see you've got your hand up.
So I'm going to quickly defer to Chuck here, but this got raised from a Cat V perspective a little bit ago. Somebody said, hey, why don't we support the V1 Beta 2 or V1 Beta 1? I forget what it was. And there was an issue that I pointed to them. Chuck, it looks like, maybe we didn't actually talk about it. It looks like over the summer you tried that, but there were unforeseen consequences. Is this handled if we move to those types?
So those types that you are, the issue that you're talking about has been fixed. And the reason we were using V1 Beta 1 was to support Kubernetes 1.13, I believe. But it seems like with the changes coming into V1 Alpha 3, our minimum management cluster is going to be V1 or 1.16, which means we can probably move the version of kubeadm forward.
And I was asking if this issue is fixed by moving the version of kubeadm forward.
Oh, I see. That I would have to look at things.
So this particular issue, I believe we would need to specify these types as fields in the kubeadm config spec. Otherwise, there's no way to plumb them through unless they happen to be part of the cluster config or init config. Jason, I think your hand was up first, and then Lubomir.
Yeah, so to address yours, they're specified separately in the config that you pass to kubeadm. But more importantly, I think we'll be okay moving to V1 Beta 2 for the kubeadm config, given the minimum version support requirements that we have. The bigger concern that I would have is we would have to handle conversion in our types between the V1 Beta 1 and V1 Beta 2 kubeadm config types, because there's no type of conversion logic that we can consume for that today.
That is definitely a thorny thing. And thank you for pointing that out. Lubomir.
So we logged a similar ticket in the kubeadm tracker about this. And there I made a proposal that we should probably not pin any API objects inside the cluster API config. Because currently we're pinning versions, how about just feeding a string with all the different config types that kubeadm supports, writing this to disk and passing it to the kubeadm binary?
So if I heard you correctly, you're saying basically accept a blob of kubeadm data and pass that through straight to kubeadm. Is that right?
Yes.
So one of the reasons we don't want to do that, we can consider it, but one of the reasons we haven't done it is that if it's just an opaque blob, we can't validate it. And so the expectation would then be that kubeadm would validate it. And unfortunately, by the time you get to invoking kubeadm, for many providers, you're part of Cloud Init or some sort of bootstrapping, and we have a horrible user experience around reporting errors back to the user once you get to that server booting phase. So if you passed in invalid data, so I don't know, an invalid kubelet config, an invalid kubeproxy config, or any of these, then it's much better for Cluster API to be able to validate that upfront than it is to wait for Cloud Init.
This creates complications with the conversion and also version pinning between the API objects. Like if you're pinning, for instance, kubeproxy v1 alpha 1, which is currently the state of the API there, it's really problematic if suddenly kubeproxy start moving faster.
Oh yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's really a good solution right now with API machinery for this. But I think it's worth continuing the conversation over time to try and get to a better spot, but we're not there yet. Jason, you had your hand up.
Well, I was just going to say, beyond the validation, we also have places where we have to plumb in values into the config based on the current state of the cluster or other configuration of the other resources as well. So it's, you know, while we could validate kind of blobs in a sense, it's more insidious than that because we also have to manipulate the resources before we inject them too.
Isn't it possible for the kubeadm binary, for instance, if we add something like --verify to pre-verify this blob?
I mean, we really need that to be a function that we can invoke from Cluster API, not from Cloud Init.
I see.
And Fabrizio, you had chatted that there was a duplicate of this issue.
Yeah, also this issue is asking to add the kube config and the kube proxy config.
Okay.
So keep one or the other, I'm fine. This issue has also a proposal for a solution specifically for the component config, because component config can be a pass-through, which is something while the other kubeadmin config type should be parsed, as Jason was saying.
Okay, so it seems like we can just close this one, 1744, as a duplicate of 1584, right?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay, Andrew, you got your hand up?
Yeah, Fabrizio, I don't remember it off the top of my head. I need to go look for it, but 1584 is the one that Andy is linking. We should link 1584 to the defaults issue that we filed over the summer, because I think part of one of the suggested solutions was support for the component config, and this they're two different issues. No, the other one's like maybe even in the image build, or it's in the old kubeadm repo, I think is where it is. The old kubeadm bootstrapper repo. Jason, do you remember the one I'm talking about? I can go find it.
So I think we migrated most everything over from the Bootstrap provider repo at this point.
Yeah, everything, all of the issues that were open a few weeks ago when we did the final cutover from the standalone repository into Cluster API, I transferred all of those Bootstrapper issues into Cluster API, and they're generally prefixed with cabpk.
Okay, I'm betting it's in the, it's not in the image builder. Where is this? It's I created this issue. Oh, I was looking in the wrong one. Bootstrap. It didn't get, if it's in the kubeadm provider, it didn't get migrated.
If it was closed for whatever reason, then it didn't get migrated.
Okay, it was not closed. It's still open. Oh, I'm not the author of it. That's what it is. I'm not the author of it in the new repo, am I? I was keying on my name. Hold on. So it's not finding it. It's this one. Let me paste it into the chat. I found it in the original location. Maybe you can see it in the new location. I just searched for the subject and didn't find it. But there's a long discussion here about.
I thought we moved all of these. Okay.
But yeah, there's a long discussion here about.
I didn't move the ones that were still in the V1 Alpha 2 milestone, the 0.
Okay, it was never resolved, so it probably should have, milestone should have been updated, but.
Yeah. Well, either way, I think we probably can rally around 1584, at least for the issue that we were originally triaging, and we probably need to come back.
Prakash, can I speak? Prakash here, can I speak? Yeah, I wanted to know, basically, since you are talking about 1584, I do have a couple of people who are working on bare metal operator in Airship, and they believe we were told that we should look into cluster API or Metal Cube, or I don't know where it belongs to. And then I'm wondering, is this the right place to this 1584 is the right place to dig into and put forces to ensure that we are able to do the bare metal, that is the they call it ephemeral host or something. Is that
So
under the context which I am referring? Maybe Batra is there. Sudeep can explain. Probably he has been on both sides, I believe. Sudeep, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Can you explain what I am trying to? Maybe I am, because new to this. You have been working
Okay.
on both sides.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let me attempt. So basically, we have been working on the bare metal operator using that metal tree, right? And I think your question is, how does it relate with the present cluster API, correct,
Yes.
Prakash?
Yes, exactly. Because
Yeah.
I need to put the 4 or 5 people into doing that. I don't know where to put it. I am just going around place to place to find where do I put that force to get the bare metal.
All right.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, go ahead.
If y'all wouldn't mind, let me get through these the issue triage, and then we can come back to your question if that's all right.
Absolutely, absolutely, no problem. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah, carry
on. You got a comment. Okay. So this one is in the milestone. I think it needs some TLC in terms of figuring out what to do, but we've already at least got it in the milestone. It is a long-term issue though, so it does have the possibility of not making 0.3, but I think we can move on to the next issue at this point unless there's any more discussion here. All right. Reset control plane initialize to false when all control plane machines are removed. I know that there had been some discussion in the related pull request here. So I had suggested that we maybe do this for standalone control plane machines, but not when we have the CubeADM control plane that we'll be working on soon. Jason indicated maybe not. So I'm not really sure what to do about this one, given that when we initially did control plane initialize, we made the decision not to call it ready because we didn't want to keep it updated, and that was a conscious change and decision that we made, because originally we had proposed it as control plane ready, but didn't really want to track whether or not the API server and the rest of the control plane was functional and ready at that, or all the time, which is something that we're trying to do as part of the CubeADM control plane work. So Chuck, I see you have your hand up. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess I've been a little torn on this one, but I guess it comes down to if this is a use case that we want to support, because I'm pretty sure that when we were building it, like you said, we weren't supporting a situation where we spin up cluster and then delete machines and then reuse the same cluster infrastructure.
Yeah, and if you read the reporter's comment, they ran into the situation where they were repeatedly creating and deleting master machines, I'm assuming by scaling a machine set to 1 and 0 and 1 and 0, which, number one, we don't support control planes backed by machine sets. So I don't know.
I've spoken with this person offline, and I'm fairly sure that they have a fork of some kind of cluster API.
All right. Vince or Jason, y'all want to weigh in? I know you added comments to the PR.
I personally would like not to change this, given that we decided consciously, as you said, like to not like make it this value specifically flip-flop. Maybe we can update documentation to like make that clear. also another thing that I actually missed was that we actually don't support control plane nodes to be in a machine set. So yeah, I would rather not do this.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's not a machine set, if it's just a single machine and you go from 1 to 0 back up to 1 just by creating and deleting, the the second machine will fail because it'll attempt to do a join based on the logic that we have in the kubeadm bootstrapper. So maybe at the very least we need to put the cluster into a terminal error state if they delete the last control plane machine or something. I don't know. Jason and then Andrew.
Yeah, I think the tricky part is that really Cluster API has no concept of control plane right now, and that was part of the impetus with using initialized is we kind of hacked around that to say that we at least did an init and the initial machine came up. Now the control plane proposal that we have out there does add a ready field, but that's because we can actually do some status checking on the control plane after it's up, whereas we don't really have that facility today. So I'm in favor of basically improving the documentation in this case, and we'll improve the actual story around it longer term.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Andrew?
Does Kubernetes even support bringing up a new control plane node against an existing etcd backend if there are no existing control plane nodes? Like if you've gone down to 0 and you basically have to bring up a new control plane node and say, attach to this existing data store or the data backend? Because if it doesn't, then this is a non-issue.
Well, there's 2 different scenarios there. There's stacked etcd versus external etcd. So if it's an external etcd,
well, either way though.
Well, if it's a stacked etcd and you wipe out all of the control plane machines, then you've also wiped out etcd. So going back.
Okay, that's true.
Yeah, so if you add a new control plane machine, you're starting with a new data store. If you have an external etcd, there very well could be a lot of cruft from your first incantation of the control plane, and then if you delete everything but keep the external etcd and then come up with a new control plane member, I don't see why it wouldn't work as long as you can get the anything that needs to be reinitialized if there is anything done in etcd, but I don't.
Nadir's saying it works in chat, which it seems weird, but okay.
Yeah, I don't think this is something. I think we should make progress with the kubeadm control plane and not try and deal with this for non-control plane based. If you're not using the control plane ref, then I don't think we should try and deal with this. Jason, then Chuck.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think we want to get into the scenario that Nadir brought up about how COPS does things, because it requires a lot of intercommunication between the core stuff and the individual infrastructure providers, which we've been trying to avoid. The other aspect is that the etcd ADM project is going to have facilities for backing up and restoring the etcd data store. And that's something that once it's available to us, we can leverage through the control plane management to get this, instead of having to kind of build that facility from scratch, which is, kind of a level of work that I don't think we want to take on as a community.
Chuck?
I wonder if it's also worth reaching out to the author of the issue and seeing what their use case is, and maybe we can find some way to make this work.
Yeah,
that's a little bit less.
I had done that. Yeah, right here. I asked if there was a specific need to be able to scale down to 0 back up, and the response was what I had highlighted a few minutes ago.
Okay. All right, my fault.
No, it's all right. All right, so we will basically close this out as not going to do it. You need to use the KubeADM control plane, right?
I think so.
Okay. I will do that later. Next up is configure CAPI manager and controllers with a config map so that we don't have to do flag after flag after flag. I think this is a nice thing to do. I did comment it needs to be a version type so that we have versioning in the in there. In terms of priority and milestone, I would probably want to say long-term and next, given how much work we're going to undertake for Alpha 3, unless you feel strongly otherwise. Chuck or Jason, I see your hands up.
So the first question that I have is, if we expect this to be something that the controllers watch and react to, I wonder if we should just add a new data type that can be added and created and treated like a singleton, because then we wouldn't have to do kind of, serialization back and forth into the config map. The alternative would be is if we mounted the config map and treated it as a config file, but then we'd have to deal with also reloading if that config map changes as well.
So in terms of reloading, my experience in doing what you said with a singleton configuration API type with Velero was we punted completely on trying to handle a reload on the fly. What we did instead was watch the singleton resource, and on any change, we just shut down the process and expected that Kubernetes would restart the pod, and that would then it was able to pick up the changes. Chuck, I see your hand is up. Was that from before?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I would probably even put this in a backlog priority. There's no real, I don't know if there's like a real desire for it or need for it.
Sure. Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say there is actually a precedent for reloading. I said it in chat, but that's what the controller manager will do for the webhook server if it notices that the certs from the secret have changed. And there's the kubelet syncing time, but so I mean it's already pulling in iNotify and everything, so it wouldn't be overly cumbersome to do that.
Yeah, thanks. Alrighty. Chuck, re-implement capd backend.
Yeah, I can just talk about this briefly. So there's a fun dependency problem right now because we've got the framework, the EDE framework, and we've got capd here. And so if capd wants to use the E2E framework, it's going to have to pull in a particular version of kind, which the framework is depending on, which of course is not the version of kind that capd is using. And the API is completely changed on kind. So I would like to move capd away from, or I'd like to move capd to the new API version of kind. It's just a lot of work because it's changed dramatically, and some of the nice functions that existed before for such things as creating a load balancer no longer exist. So there's a lot of work to be done to pull out. Basically, this is all in service of removing exec commands from the E2E framework. This is sort of the first step in that.
Okay. Is this, I'm guessing, long-term important?
Yeah. And if anybody enjoys working with kind and learning about the new API, this would be I think probably a good place to start.
Do you want to tag this help wanted, or is it too complex?
It's pretty big. Yeah, it's pretty big.
Okay. Alrighty.
Yeah, we can just leave it around for now.
So we had a request to have a cluster deployment or cluster set to allow you to create multiple replicas of a cluster. My comment was that this is probably better for tooling outside of and on top of Cluster API, and that it would most likely be a tool to stamp out replicas of clusters, mainly because I think that trying to reconcile cluster replicas would be somewhat difficult, especially if you ever wanted to change the number of worker nodes in one cluster versus another. We've got this marked as awaiting more evidence and have suggested a couple times that this can be on top of Cluster API. Anybody have any thoughts on this or disagreement with that idea? All right. So I am going to, thank you, Erwin. Sudeep, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, not related to this, just another one. Like, I'm trying to figure out if there is a like proper documentation for using Cluster API using GCP. So, does that work? Is there any representation from GCP folks to confirm it is working and the link to replicate the Cluster API?
Sure answer is sure answer is no. We don't have like any docs. Like there's some examples that you can use, and there's one open issue about like adding to the quick start, but that's still a work in progress.
Well, the short answer is it works, right?
It works. So, but like kind of like a longer answer is like we do have end-to-end conformance tests running on it, which is a good sign that like it actually works, and it's actually tracking v1 alpha 3 and not v1 alpha 2. So it might break. That's for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, like the v1 alpha 2 might break presently if I'm trying to use GCP as my provider, right?
No. v1 alpha 2 is stable, and
Okay.
If it doesn't work, then there's a bug somewhere. And once we get the documentation added to the quick start, you'll be able to follow. Oh, that's weird. So you'll be able to follow.
Yeah, I noticed that also. There's something wrong in the
and you'll
first
see a
link.
tab here for GCP. We just don't have the documentation yet. But in general, it's going to be very similar to what you see here, where instead of an AWS cluster, you'd have a GCP cluster, and you'd have GCP specific information, and the same thing with the machines. And all of that does work today.
And if I attempt it and I get issues, then should I raise the issues in the same Cluster API GitHub link?
Usually in the GCP provider, that would be best. Yeah.
The GCP provider. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Alrighty. Next up, we have ability to disable rolling updates. This is a request to turn off the code optionally in machine deployments to do the actual updating. And the suggestion was to allow max unavailable and max surge to both be 0, and then have something else, I guess, manipulate the machine sets, although not quite sure how this would work exactly. Anybody, Vince?
Yeah, I'm kind of against this change, especially like right now that like the existing machine deployments are I don't want to say frozen, but like I would like to keep the code as it is, given that like we're trying to rewrite it like with our best practices. And this is a logic change that kind of like it brings in a new API contract that we'll need to guarantee to users, which I would rather like see done outside of Cluster API and not within the current controllers.
Yeah, I think we probably need some more information from John here. I feel like with the machine deployment reconciler, it's not doing, I mean, there's a lot of logic in there and some of it's very complex, but at the end of the day, it's manipulating machine sets and that's pretty much it. So I think if you wanted to do the same sort of thing, you could probably copy and paste the code and have as a starting point and use a different reconciler. So like maybe the request is the ability to turn off the machine deployment reconciler in the CAPI manager and have something else process them. But I think we probably need some more information. So I'm going to move this to next. I'll follow up with John and see if he can give us some more information. And last up here, I know, Jason, you had some back and forth questions on this one around the machine set and machines being deleted. Are you still waiting on evidence on this one, Jason?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I was trying to figure out was clarification on the behaviors that they were expecting, whether it was just that we're not properly keeping the status in sync as the machines are deleted in the background, or if they expected the actual scaling events of deleting individual machines to be serialized and blocked for further operations until the full machine is deleted.
Yeah.
I think the former behavior is what I would expect rather than the latter behavior.
Yeah, my interpretation was that they were interested in having the machine set reconciler wait for a machine to be fully deleted before proceeding with any additional operations. But I went ahead and moved this to next and added the awaiting more evidence thing on this. Andrew, your hand's up.
Come back to me when you're done with this one because it's the one right before. I just didn't get the comment in.
Oh, I think we're done with this one. So
okay. I just added a comment to this one. There is a request on CAPV. We used to have this thing called maintenance mode that disabled the controller loop for a machine if there was an annotation set on it. It just seems to me like it's sort of related. Maybe some annotation that we might promote to CAPI to imply some broader maintenance mode. Like, don't make any changes. We need things to stay the way they are when we look at something. Just made a comment there.
Jason?
I was just going to say, we have that today. You can basically pause the deployment and you can take actions behind there and then unpause it. So is that similar to what you're talking about, Andrew?
I suppose I'd have to look into this issue more and why that doesn't solve this issue. It is essentially basically pausing a controller, the vSphere machine controller in this case.
All right.
You know, I'm sorry. I was saying I was just discussing maybe some broader flag that means that all providers could acknowledge and agree upon.
Yeah, I would say maybe file an issue in CAPI, Andrew, if you've got some concrete requirements, maybe. All right. Prakash, I know you had a question and we've got about 5 minutes left. So would you like to ask it?
Yeah, the question I have is the context for slide set. Context is that I'm working in Airship, and Airship has flow which is related to bare metal operator, and that bare metal operator is dealing with Ionic. So I am working with a team from Dell, and the job what we have is to make sure that we are able to configure the RAID and the BIOS for the bare metal host. To be able to do that, earlier we were asked to follow the bootstrap, remote bootstraps, some Airship Cuttle remote bootstrap thread. Eventually, we were told now that it is part of cluster API. So the cluster API deals with two things. One is the ephemeral cluster, other is the target cluster. So ephemeral cluster is simply supposed to be some bare metal. And so I'm trying to figure out how is cluster API, metal cube, and bare metal operators related. Where do I plug myself in to deliver the bare metal operator, that is the machine instance creation, with configuration prior to instantiating, and those configurations relate to BIOS, UEFI boot, and probably RAID. So does that explain my question? Where do I look for? I'm grasping in dark whether to go to metal cube, to go to cluster. So I get pushed from one to the other group to the other group. And I had come to this group earlier, 3 months back. At that time, I was asked to go to metal cube and there was nobody in metal cube to answer. So maybe I'm trying to figure out where is the place to ask and where do I engage to deliver with our people we have.
I don't know that I have a great answer. Jason, any thoughts?
So I think you've mentioned a few concerns across a few different layers of the cluster API. So some of the stuff as far as how do I generically plumb some of this information towards an individual machine as part of the bootstrapping, that could potentially fall into kind of the core cluster API and the kubeadm bootstrapper that we have. But then as far as the direct interaction with the hardware, that would be through an actual infrastructure provider similar to MetalCube, if you're able to use that today, or a similar type of implementation.
So to answer that, initially when I started, I thought Kapi was going to address it because you had one was infrastructure plugin and the other was supposed to be some cluster plugin, and that is the target cluster plugin, whatever we call. And so my understanding was I'm going to directly deal with the infrastructure plugin here, and then the infrastructure plugin I was asked to go into MetalCube, and I could not really figure out in MetalCube because the people there were saying that hey, everything is fixed. They were more focused on the OpenShift, and they were not really, I could not really figure out what exactly that means. Still you have to deal with the hardware, right, under cloud or whatever the bare metal is. Where do I put that in? So if you point me to MetalCube, do you have any specific thing which I can probe, or is it that because who initiates, who executes, the flow is not clear to me still.
So it really depends on the specific resource that you're talking about. When we switch to V1, like in the V1 Alpha 1 world, which I think is what MetalCube is still using, basically the implementation of the individual machines and the cluster resources was deferred down to the actual provider implementations themselves. With V1 Alpha 2 and beyond, we've created a model where Cluster API handles the generic resources, and then there are provider-specific resources that the providers themselves reconcile. So when MetalCube actually adopts a newer version of Cluster API, then they would have the model to where you would only interact with their provider-specific, like they would only really reconcile and act on their provider-specific resources, and the generic resources will be handled by Cluster API. So the more difficult part is how to engage with the MetalCube community. Unfortunately, I can't really provide any additional information there because they're their own kind of project and they're not under the Kubernetes SIGs and kind of the SIG cluster lifecycle umbrella that the AWS provider, GCP provider, and so on are part of, that's really something that community would have to kind of handle, I guess.
Yeah, so we are 2 minutes over. So Prakash, I would recommend that you follow up with either the MetalCube or the Cluster API folks in the Kubernetes Slack, and we'd be happy to have another discussion on this in a future office hours. But we are out of time today, and I know that at least several people all need to go over to.
I appreciate for the time and inputs. I will go ahead and try to get in the Slack. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. I will post the recording once it's available, and have a great Wednesday.